welcome to this conversation with Scottish composer Jay Capperauld. My name is Charlotte Perkins. I'm the Scottish Chamber Orchestra's graduate trainee this year, and we're thrilled to be chatting with Jay. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, of course, the SCO is premiering your new work, Death in a Nutshell, on Thursday the 11th. How long has this been in the works?
Well, this has been in the works for the last year, so this has kind of been my lockdown project, if you like. So it was great to have, as I was saying to you before we started this project really has been my sort of North Star, if you like, throughout the whole sort of pandemic. So it's been so nice to have something like this to be working on. Although it's a sort of morbid topic, it's been a real pleasure and a joy to sort of explore all of these ideas as part of this concert that's coming up in the next week.
Yeah, of course, you did many collaborations throughout lockdown with the RSNO and doing sort of virtual thing. Are you thinking about different things when you write for a virtual group versus, writing for the SCO to perform live?
It's an interesting question, actually. And I suppose in a way that you do, because you know that the presentation is going to be entirely different. But in some sort of sense, for me anyway, that the content of the music is still the thing that's got to be driving the project. And so if that content is there and you're thinking about it in the right way, then that shouldn't really change much depending on how it's going to be presented. Because the hope is at some point is that we'll be able to come back live together at some sort of stage and actually perform these on, in person on a stage in a concert hall as well. So the idea is that these sort of other projects were just sort of driven by the actual content itself.
Let's give the audience a little bit of a background into you as a musician. You began your journey as a classical saxophonist and you ended up a composer. How did that happen?
It's all a bit of a mystery, to be quite honest. So I started off as a classical saxophone player in the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, which is where I studied as part of my undergraduate. And I was really dabbling in composition at that sort of point, and sort of finding my way with it, kind of finding out what my musical language was and what I liked, but all the while sort of beelining for this sort of career that I had in mind of becoming a saxophone player in orchestras. And it wasn't until the then head of department, Gordon Mcmillan, approached me in the corridor one day, and he's quite a sort of straightforward talking guy, and he just approached me and just said, "You're Jay, aren't you?" I was like, "Yes," and he was like, "You're a composer." I was like, "Oh, I didn't know that I was a composer, but I'm up for exploring that." And so it was really from there that he allowed me some performance opportunities, gave me a bit of experience working with musicians, getting the chance to hear my music. And then I was very fortunate enough that he then invited me on to the master's course as part of the LCS. And from there, I really just haven't looked back. I've been so fortunate since graduating that I've worked with some amazing musicians, and I count myself lucky every single time that you're asked to write music, or that I'm asked to write music. Because every sort of phone call in that sense is an absolute blessing, because all I'm doing is writing music, and it's just such a joy and privilege to be able to say that that's my job and that that's what I can do. And so since graduating, I've worked with the likes of the RSNO, as you've mentioned, and the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, and I've written a piece actually over lockdown for the BBC Proms, which was about the lockdown experience. And I just really count myself lucky that I'm able to sort of call myself a composer, even though these days, I must admit, I would probably have to dust off my saxophone case. I don't practice as often as I get the opportunity to do these days.
Well, you mentioned, getting phone calls and getting asked to write music. And you mentioned just a few people you've worked with, but you've also worked with pretty much every ensemble there is to work with in Scotland, it feels like, from the Red Note Ensemble to youth groups and community orchestras, and also Alexander McCall Smith. But somehow this is the first time working with the SCO. What does this particular partnership mean to you?
Well, actually, in a funny way, this isn't the first time that I've worked with the SCO, because when I was in high school, and I was just reminded of this morning, actually, when I was thinking about our interview today, when I was in high school, we were part of a project whereby we went and workshopped some compositions that we wrote for Scottish Chamber Orchestra players. So there was a piece that I wrote which was for flute, bassoon and trumpet. And that really was actually my first chance ever working with some live musicians, and certainly, live musicians who were of that calibre of performing standard as well. And so the idea of the project is that we got the opportunity to write these pieces, and they were recorded for us to then keep, and they put them on a sort of album of all the different pupils, the school pupils who were involved in that project. So in a funny sort of way, I've worked with the SCO before, but this is the first sort of official commission from the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, which I'm just absolutely privileged to be a part of and to have this opportunity to write for the SCO, because I've followed the orchestra for so many years and I've gone to so many of their concerts, and so many of their concerts stick out in my own mind as sort of like first musical experiences. I remember actually going to see the Chamber Orchestra play the Psycho soundtrack, which was just an amazing experience. And I think they also performed Frankenstein as well, which is the Gruber composition, which is just a phenomenal work. I mean, it's so colourful and just so vibrant. I was just captivated by the orchestra. So it's nice to think this was almost like a kind of full circle moment for me, which is a real joy.
Well, thematically as well, I think we would say, with the works you've heard them do and the work you're offering. So tell us a little bit about the commission process. As a composer, you get a call from the SCO. They say, we'd like you to do a work. You say what?
Oh yeah, so essentially it was just a case of this idea that I'd had in mind was floating around for a wee while, and I was just essentially looking for the right opportunity to be able to sort of execute it. Unfortunately enough, the Scottish Chamber Orchestra is so open-minded in terms of their programming that I was able to sort of pitch to them, and then they were really keen on this idea about death in a nutshell. And so the idea behind the piece, for those that don't know, is that it's based on Francis Glessner Lee's nutshell studies of unexplained death. Which is kind of a morbid topic once you sort of start to go into things. But essentially it's a set of 20 dollhouse-sized rooms, which are sort of furnished in kind of 1940s, 1950s decor. And each of them contain a sort of true crime scene, which is all sort of fashioned in miniature scale, where the dolls, or say one doll or a group of dolls, have died under mysterious circumstances. So it's quite an unusual topic. And for me as a composer, it's certainly what I'm interested in exploring, is trying to sort of weave unusual and unique narratives within music. That's something that can then become really engaging for an audience, but also maybe a wee bit challenging, which is where the thematic ideas of death, murder and crime, which are not often explored in a piece of concert music, say, that's going to be presented on stage, is something that's maybe hopefully going to be a sort of new experience for the audiences, certainly.
Tell us about how you discovered this particular source of inspiration.
Just down the sort of internet rabbit hole, really. It's just it's one of those sort of days that you spend all day on the internet and you never quite know where you're going to find yourself or where you end up. It was really just one of those. But I'm sort of interested in those sort of macabre subjects anyway. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, I must admit. I'm kind of into sort of like crime novels and mystery novels and sort of seances and the kind of like darker elements and sort of more, what would you say, esoteric stories, perhaps. So that's something that I've always certainly been drawn to. And one theme in particular, which has become quite prevalent for me as a composer, is this idea of the vanitas, which is essentially an image of a skull that's represented in Renaissance art. But it's the idea that the skull is the kind of ever-present sort of motive force that death represents within life. So it's not so morbid when you start to think about it, because it's the idea that death is this motive, as I say, motive force, which is sort of making you do things and getting you out there and actually living. And in fact, on my desk just now, I always keep this by me. I don't know if you can sort of see that in the light there. It's a wee sort of vanitas skull that I like to keep next to my desk, because it's always that sort of that reminder, especially within art, that everything is sort of finite in some sort of sense, and that or it's not, in fact, it's not finite. What's the right word that I'm looking for? It's sort of, everything is ephemeral, really. So although, we've got this idea that composers are these sort of like romantic figures that sort of carve away at music in order to sort of come up with something that sort of speaks to the human experience. And although I like that as a notion in some sort of sense, I like also just applying the idea of the vanitas to that, just to sort of say, yeah, but we're all going to be dead soon. So, don't be too precious about your music or life,
Certainly. It's interesting to me that the inspiration you've chosen is a non-textual one. Certainly, a lot of composers work with death. In fact, the orchestra performed Shostakovich 14 this week, which is settings of 11 poems about death. I think it's different setting text versus setting these scenes. How did you go about turning them into sound?
I mean, it's a funny process because, I mean, it makes everything absolutely abstract in that way. And it makes things a lot more subjective, I think. Sometimes when you have text as a composer, there is something quite concrete there to work with in terms of either the emotions that are being put across or a narrative that's being conveyed within the text. Whereas when you're working with these sort of rooms of sort of macabre dollhouse death scenes, the narrative is really, the world then becomes your oyster, you know, and it's all about sort of, I suppose, my response to the rooms, and then how you represent those musically and how you represent those orally for the audience members. And so certainly one of the things that I've tried to explore within the sound world is to try and capture that sense of the macabre. So a lot of the elements that's within the musical elements that are within the music sounds kind of like it maybe comes out of a horror soundtrack in some sort of sense, but it's been able to then sort of play around with the audience's expectations with regards to that. So and also then trying to sort of leave musical clues, as it were, within the music. And so in some sort of sense, what I've tried to do is take the object. So for example, if I speak about one of the rooms in particular, there is the kitchen room, which is set out in a way that just sort of looks like a, you know, just everyday 1950s domestic bliss, if you like. So you've got the sort of net curtains hanging up, you've got an ironing board with a pile of sort of washing ready to be ironed, you've got a sort of colander full of sort of half-peeled potatoes, the fridge door is there, the fridge is there, but the fridge door is sort of lying half open, and the oven's there, there's a sort of fresh pie just sort of sitting out the oven. It all looks very, very normal, apart from this doll, this woman who's lying in the middle of the floor, which is just, it looks like a complete shock. And so immediately you're sort of wondering what is going on, because nothing really looks quite out of the ordinary within that scene, until you start to sort of, you know, you then look into the sort of scene, and you can sort of see that the doorway to the side has been sort of stuffed with newspaper. And then there's a knife that's sitting just to the side of the door frame. And there are also these, what would you call them? Sort of accompanying text, that sort of scenarios, if you like, that sort of accompany each of the scenes, that sort of give you a bit of extra information. And so you then find out that her husband came home and discovered the body after looking in through the window. And then he sort of went round to the front door and tried this door and discovered that the door that we now know to be sort of stuffed with the newspaper was locked when he tried it. So you sort of start to then think about, well, has this been a suicide attempt in some sort of way, whether it's been sort of like poisoning from the oven through sort of gas or something like that, or something more sinister being going on. Because actually then when you start to look at things in a finer detail, you see that the tablecloth and the table has been moved askew, and this table sits underneath the window. So has someone sort of broken entry, someone who knows how to get into the property, perhaps the husband, you know. So there's all these sort of different elements that are going on, which for me as a composer becomes delicious, because there's so much to work with in terms of the material that you can then come up with. So for that movement in particular, one of the identifying features is the pots and pans that the percussionists play. So we then sort of become aware that there's kind of kitchen utensils in the mix that sort of gives that flavour of the kitchen environment. But within the actual content of the rest of the orchestra, we find that they're all playing sort of muddied harmonies that kind of scrunch together, but also microtones that kind of even sort of like, it sort of gives that sense of sort of vapors in the air. Perhaps there's still sort of like gas leaking out of this oven that's maybe caused this woman to collapse and then die from the fumes maybe. And the interesting thing is about these the nutshell studies is that no one really knows what the true solutions are. So they're housed in the Maryland medical examiner's office in Baltimore. And he's the medical examiner himself is the only person who has the key. So he's got the key to the safe that tells you all of the solutions. And so the idea is that these nutshell studies are still being used to this day for training purposes for forensic scientists and medical examiners and detectives. And I think it's so fascinating to see just how successful those rooms have been, and just to show you how much detail Francis Glesner Lee put into each of the rooms to show you that, you know, they're still used to this day. And so there's been so much for me to work with as a composer there. As I mentioned in the kitchen, there's just so much sort of detail to work with, and then certain sort of, maybe there's like a stabbing cord that sort of represents the knife that's lying in the room. But it's really up to the audience's interpretation. I think I'm really keen to see what they make of it, because I'm trying also not to put a solution out there. I'm just trying to present the evidence, if you like, and then it's up to the audience to kind of essentially become musical forensic investigators, if you like. And so really what I'm trying to do as a composer is to not provide any answers, is just to then provide questions for the audience, so that that's their way into the piece, and then they can really make up their own mind.
Do you have in your mind musical solutions, as it were, that you're not sharing with the audience?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you know, I don't want to ever give the game away, because essentially I think that's what the piece is about. It's about trying to question what's happening in the piece and why is it happening. And I think for me as a composer and as a creator, that's where the more interesting questions start to arise, is when you start to find a way into asking why. So it's not just what an instrument is doing or who they're playing alongside or what are they accompanied by. It's why are they acting in that way? Why are they accompanied by these other instruments? Are they colluding in some sort of way to conspire against another instrument in order to sort of, you know, seek out their demise in some sort of sense, you know? So really what I'm trying to do is to sort of like play around with audience expectations, stereotypes to some degree, but also then just to present something that the audience can kind of find their own way into. So that, because I think, you know, as you're talking about text, in that sense, there is something concrete there, but with this sort of material, hopefully I've sort of given a bit of insight into my sort of thinking about how to turn something that's entirely abstract and subjective from my point of view, and then make it subjective for someone else, or to leave it open in some sort of way so that someone else can be subjective about it and sort of find their own way into it. You know, does that make sense? I don't know if I've explained myself all right there.
Absolutely. It almost sounds like you're proposing a different model for listening and engagement by the audience, sort of in general. It sounds like it goes beyond your piece for you.
I think that's really just how I generally think about music and how I listen to music, really. And I think certainly for me as a listener, especially when I was a young listener, I actually really struggled just listening to a piece that was called Symphony, you know. Sure. Because it's, you know, what does that represent? What is it trying to say? What does it mean? And at that time, when there wasn't, say, a story attached to it, I think I would find it difficult to find a way into the piece. And so I think that's why probably a lot of my pieces are usually about something, and they have a really, really distinct, either a distinct emotive flavour or conceptual flavour, or you know, any of that sort of stuff that sort of makes it something that goes beyond music itself. So there's another way into it, if you like. So, you know, as you've mentioned, a lot of my music has been inspired by other subjects. So, you know, I've written pieces about seances and broken technology, and obviously, you know, things like lockdown experiences, mental health. You know, there's always something that my music tends to be about, which for me, even still as a listener, I do enjoy that. But it's maybe just the way that I sort of think about music, which allows me to sort of question what's going on, and then to be able to sort of come away with my own answers or interpretation about what I've just listened to or what I've just experienced in a concert hall.
For listeners who are unfamiliar with the rest of your work, they might be a little bit shocked to hear a piece just straight up called Death in a Nutshell. But of course, this is a recurring theme throughout your work, and a lot of your titles are similarly a bit shocking. Are you going for that shock factor at all?
No, not necessarily. It's not something that I'm consciously trying to do in my titles. I think what I try to do with my titles is to come up with a word or a phrase that I feel just represents the entirety of that piece. And again, for me, it's another way for the audience to find their way into the piece. There was, again, to reference Gordon McPherson, who was my teacher as part of Masters, we had long discussions about titles. And he had a really great way of explaining it, whereby he says that titles, it's almost like you're sort of skimming stones. So if you're aiming in one direction, it may hit off a rock and go another direction, but there's still that sort of sense of what the object is. And titles, I think, are a wee bit like that. It sort of gives you an overview of what the concept is, but it may sort of allow for an audience to kind of go off in a different direction if they have a different experience in the concert hall. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm intentionally trying to come up with sort of provocative or shocking titles. It's not really in my nature to sort of want to shock in that way. Although I must admit, years ago I went through a phase where I was really, really into shock art, and I just loved that whole sort of Britpop movement and stuff. But there's a time and a place for that sort of stuff, and I think that certainly for my own titles, all I'm trying to do really is just to come up with the essence of the piece, and hopefully that gives people a sort of way into the music then from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned your teacher at RCS, and I want to bring up another, as I understand it, mentor of yours who is in fact conducting this program. Can you tell us about your connection to Sir James Mcmillan?
Well, James has been a huge champion and supporter of my music for a number of years now, and he's been so generous with his time and with his advice. He's sort of, as it were, sort of taken me under his wing when I first sort of graduated, and sort of like showed me the ropes of the industry, if you like. But he's also conducted a number of my pieces in concerts and in rehearsals. So he knows my musical language incredibly well. And he's also programmed my work in a number of the Cumnock Trist Festival concerts, which he established in our shared hometown of Cumnock, which again is another one of those sort of funny sort of full circle moments, because I actually became aware of James's work when I was a young student at Cumnock Academy, which is the school that we both went to, obviously years and years apart. But so from a relatively young age, I was aware of his work. And I suppose in some sort of sense, it gave me a sense of what it is to sort of be a composer from that point, because actually up until that sort of stage, I only really thought that composers were all dead, So he was really the first composer that I ever came across who was a living composer. And also then to have that sort of double whammy of the fact that he's from the same home area as me as well. So it was incredible to sort of learn about his work. And actually I remember our school taking us to a BBC SSO concert, which was actually, it was a concert / sort of workshop session of one of his pieces, whereby they gave us a kind of compositional breakdown of one of his pieces. And so that to me was just a fascinating process to sort of learn what a composer thinks and how they sort of go about that composition process, and how he sort of layered his material up from that sort of point. And obviously at that stage, when I was a young composer, we were sort of in the process of trying to write our compositions for our like GCSEs and hires and things like that. So to actually see the compositional process in front of me at that workshop was just absolutely incredible to see that process. And then they gave us one of his albums as a kind of souvenir after that project. And I just remember getting really hooked on one of his pieces, which is called The World's Ransoming, which is The World's Ransoming or The Ransoming of the World. I forget which way around it is, but it was just such a captivating piece. And it's one of those ones that sort of stuck in my mind. Just the musical journey of that piece is stuck in my mind for such a long time. So it's a real joy that he's going to be conducting my piece as part of this concert. I'm so honoured. And as I say, he knows my musical material very well. And it's great to have someone who's a great conductor, but also a great composer who can sort of approach the piece in rehearsals from those two mindsets. So he knows what to get from the musicians. They're obviously fantastic, phenomenal musicians anyway, but who also has that composer mindset.
What do you think of as your role in the rehearsals? You're in the room, and what are you doing?
Well, my role in the rehearsals is really just to step in. I think if anything is not how I would hope it to be in terms of a specific effect maybe that I'm looking for. I think generally that's what I find is that there are certain things that composers are trying to achieve within their music, especially if it's new music and it's something that, say, I'm trying out for the first time, that you don't quite know if it's going to work yet. And so a lot of the rehearsal process for me is about finding out whether if an issue arises, whether it's my responsibility to sort of try and figure it out, or my responsibility to help explain what it is that I'm meaning from an effect or from a certain musical phrase, or from the sort of dramatic direction side of things. And I really love the rehearsal processes, because that's where, for me, the real creation begins. You can sit for months alone as a composer writing music, and you can write that until you're blue in the face, but it doesn't become that music until you then finally hand it over to the musicians. And obviously, as I say, I've known the Scottish Chamber Orchestra performers for a number of years. I've practically grown up with some of them in the orchestra, which is great to know those distinct personalities as well. So in the writing process, what the joy for me is that you can then write for those personalities. The person who's going to be playing the piece, and so you can sort of use that to your advantage in some sort of sense. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the musicians' reactions are going to be, because it's always that, it's quite nerve-wracking when you first hand over a new piece, to sort of gauge their reaction. How do they respond to it? Do they like it? Do they absolutely hate it? I've no idea. You never really find out until probably sometimes even the concert as to what their sort of reactions and opinions are to it. But I love that process. It's kind of what I live for, and I think perhaps some of that still comes from my sort of experience as a performing musician as well. I just love that rehearsal process.
Have you ever had a reaction from a musician that really surprised you or really set you back at all?
Certainly for one of my pieces, which is a piano concerto that I wrote called Endlings, which is about environmental issues and climate change. And so within that piece, what I was trying to do was to represent certain endlings, which are essentially categorized as the last individual of their species. And so it's quite a harrowing sort of topic in that sort of sense, is that we're really experiencing or we're with the last individual of a certain species at its sort of final moments. And the surprising thing from that was just how sort of emotional some of the musicians were. And I had some really lovely comments from the musicians after their performance of that piece, and including some of the audience members who said that they were sort of welling up at the sort of idea of it all, and the musical content and things, which for me is I mean, that's just incredible that you can sort of touch people in that way. And I think that really just shows you just how powerful music is as an expression and as a sort of emotive experience for people. So that was certainly a moment that gave me pause for thought, because I think sometimes, because you spend so much time alone as a composer, not interacting with people, you've got to sort of bear in mind that you are going to be interacting with people in some sort of sense, because what you're doing is representing a sort of psychology or your own thought processes as a live experience on stage, and you're trying to have that kind of mental communication with another member of the audience, but through music. And I think that's what gave me pause for thought, was just how powerful that can be. When you then sort of chat to people after the concert and just find out how they've experienced the creation that you've sort of concocted. It's a really special moment, that.
When you are composing, to what extent are you thinking, I'm hoping they'll react to it in this way, or are you just writing stuff that you like and fingers crossed it works? Yeah,
I mean, I sort of, in some sense, I do just write for myself, and I think that is, I know that can sound quite indulgent, and it can sound like quite a selfish act, but the creative process kind of is, and that's not to sound controversial about it. I think most creative people would probably say something similar, or along those similar lines, or at least that you need to write for yourself first and then an audience second. And it always sort of reminds me of a video of David Bowie sort of talking about that, who's one of my musical heroes. I just absolutely adore Bowie. I think he's incredible. And he sort of talks about that in a sense that you should never play to the gallery. You should always write for yourself, and you should always try and push yourself to sort of go out of your own comfort zone in that sort of way in the creative process. Whereby he sort of says that if you're imagine it that you're sort of in a body of water and you sort of keep walking out a distance until your feet aren't quite touching the floor, and that's when you're in a position to do something really exciting. I think he sums it up quite nicely in that video. It's always kind of circulating around Twitter and the internet, always sort of crops up on his birthday and things. But for me, that kind of captures that experience a wee bit, is that you've got to write for yourself first, because that means that you will be speaking honestly as a creator. And for me, that's incredibly important. And I think that's probably why a lot of my concepts tend to come out in the wash in the way that they do. And like you know, we were just discussing the titles there. And again, it's just about the honesty of it all. You know, for me, I've got to feel authentic as a creator. So I've got to be satisfied first, myself with the creation before I then sort of hand it over to other people. And I suppose in that sense, I've got certain expectations as to how an audience member may react to something, but actually I'm pretty happy for anyone. If they've got any kind of reaction to it, then I think I've done my job well, you know, whether it's a good or bad reaction, you know.
Sure. I'm wondering, when you're depicting something more concrete, or I think a lot of your work is what in the old days would have been termed programmatic, you know, it has a story. To what extent do you feel like that influences how much of you can put into the work? If you're trying to depict something specific.
I suppose if I'm trying to depict something really specific, it then becomes a case that it's my reaction to the specificity, if you like. So in this sense, essentially this piece is my reaction to the dollhouse rooms and all the different clues and evidence that I've been able to see and that I've been able to garner in order to then represent that musically. So I think that's really what it boils down to in that instance, is that my reaction is still the thing that comes up with the musical content per se, even if it's something that becomes sort of subliminal in some sort of sense. And it's kind of funny how all of that sort of works in the end, in the creative process. And you sort of look back on it, and it's only then in retrospect that you discover what you were doing. It certainly is for me anyway, in my own creative process, is that what I tend to find is that I go, aha, that's what I was doing in that moment when I was writing that section, because I was reacting to this element of one of the rooms or whatever it happens to be. So I think that although I'm trying to sort of represent, you know, either the character of one of the deceased dolls or the sort of storyline behind it, as to why they've found themselves in that position, or whatever it happens to be, is that there's still some sort of like subliminal element there of my own kind of essence that's kind of reacting to it in some sort of way, I think. Anyway, I may be entirely wrong, I don't know.
Sure. Well, I want to venture down this biographical route just a little bit further. Of course, Sir James Mcmillan writes a lot of pieces that are responding to Scotland in various ways. To what extent do you think of your own work as Scottish work?
I think just purely of the fact that it's come that I am Scottish, you know.
Sure.
It's not. It's something that's just much more deeply ingrained than anything that you can sort of put your finger on. It's about life experience. It's about how you've grown up and where you've grown up, the people that you've met along the way. I'm kind of a Scottish composer just by pure fact of living here and not existing in a place, but actually living within it. You know, Scottishness is just ingrained within me, as it is, you know, the Cumnock area in Ayrshire is ingrained within me, and all the culture that goes along with sort of living in these sort of areas. It's like, you know, the difference between sort of someone who lives in the west coast of Scotland or someone who lives in the east coast of Scotland. Everyone's still Scottish, but it's totally different experiences in terms of how you grow up and how you experience the two cities. You know, even if you think of, you know, Glasgow and Edinburgh, you know, they're vastly different cities in terms of like mentality, class, and just experience in that same sort of way as well. And certainly as a West Coaster, you know, all of that sort of like is just ingrained within me, I think. And there's probably, even now that I think about it, you know, a bluntness to the kind of West Coast mentality, which is probably prevalent in a lot of my music, because my music tends to just be very straightforward. It doesn't sort of beat around the bush in any sort of way. It just sort of, it goes straight down the line, and what I'm trying to say is exactly what's being said musically. You know, I'm not the most articulate when I speak, but certainly I'm able to sort of hopefully do that within my music in a sort of direct way that I think is for me anyway, sort of alludes to kind of West Coastness. So maybe that's something that is sort of ingrained that makes me a Scottish composer. I don't know. I think for me, it's something that becomes more sort of like in the ether in some sort of way, rather than sort of anything that you can kind of even put your finger on, really.
Mm-hmm. I've got one more question to ask about your upcoming premiere. a lot of composers, when they deal with death, they offer some sort of redemption at the end, resurrection story at the end, this kind of thing. Without offering any spoilers, does this work offer that kind of message, or is that not the goal?
It's not the goal, not to not to put a dampener on it, but it's not the goal. The goal of this piece is to essentially represent evidence, you know. So it's got to be, although it's my subjective response, in another, you know, that flip side of the coin is that it's actually quite objective as well, because I'm putting forward the sort of evidence of the sort of clues, what's lying around the rooms and all the rest of it. So there's not really a sort of overarching comment on death from my own sort of personal perspective as to, you know, what I think maybe may or may not be in the afterlife, for example, or how I feel about death as a subject anyway. Although, you know, I'm obviously responding to death. It's not that I'm trying to add my own sort of slant to it or my own spin, or indeed even to tell the audience how they should feel about death. You know, I think what I'm trying to do with this piece is just to say, here's the evidence, let's examine it, let's try and solve a sort of musical puzzle, if you like, and then for the audience to come away with their own opinions. And that's what I love about audiences, is that you can play them all the same piece of music. And if you've got an audience of 1,000, 2,000 people, you will have 1,000 to 2,000 interpretations of that piece, you know. And I've never really bought into the idea that one piece of music can send out one specific message, you know. I think that audiences are far more intelligent than that, you know, and they can find their own way into things as well.
And finally, Jay, if people want to listen to your music, where can they find it?
You can find me on my website, which is www.jaycapperauld.com, and I've got some videos up there. I've got some SoundCloud clips up there, some of my work as well, and I've got some scores that are up there for sale as well, which is something that I've just been dabbling in. But yeah, it's just a pleasure to be able to share my music with everyone, and I'm so looking forward to the concert this week.
Well, as a reminder for listeners, the SCO is premiering Jay's work, Death in a Nutshell, in Edinburgh on the 11th of November and in Glasgow on the 12th. Tickets are available through the SCO website, which is sco.org.uk. Jay, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.